Picture this. You are standing at the edge of the desert, where the fertile black soil of the Nile Valley quietly fades into an ocean of sand. The sun is sinking low, washing the western horizon in deep amber, blood orange, and soft violet hues. As the light thins, shapes begin to move. Jackals, lean silhouettes slipping between stone and shadow. Their ears stand alert, their eyes catching the last glow of daylight, reflecting an intelligence that feels almost human. They roam the boundary between the living world and the necropolis, the vast city of the dead carved into the desert cliffs. To the ancient Egyptians watching from their mud brick homes, these animals were more than scavengers. They were watchers, messengers, guardians of a threshold no living person could cross and return unchanged. If you enjoy drifting into sleep with ancient stories like this one, you're welcome to gently support the channel by liking the video or subscribing. It helps these quiet myths continue to be told, and now you can simply relax and listen. Because this is where our story truly begins. Not with towering temples, sacred rituals, or clashing gods, but with these silent, black-backed canines pacing the edges of burial grounds. For long before Anubis became the jackal-headed god, painted on tomb walls across Egypt, before he guided souls and weighed hearts, he emerged from a very real and unsettling problem. The dead were not staying buried. In the earliest days of Egyptian civilization, during what we call the pre-dynastic period, somewhere around 6,000 years ago, people were buried in simple, shallow graves carved into the desert sand. The hot, dry conditions would naturally preserve the body, turning it into what we might recognize as a natural mummy. It was a perfect system, elegant in its simplicity, except for one significant complication. The jackals wouldn't leave them alone. These wild dogs, perfectly adapted to desert life, had keen noses that could detect a burial from remarkable distances. They'd dig up the graves, scatter the remains, feed on the flesh. For a culture that was beginning to develop beliefs about the afterlife, about the importance of preserving the body so the soul could return to it, this was more than just disturbing. It was a spiritual catastrophe. If the body was destroyed, consumed, scattered to the four winds, what happened to the person's essence? Where did their ka, their life force, go? Where did their biya, their personality and soul, find rest? The solution that emerged was ingenious in its psychological sophistication. Rather than trying to fight the jackals, rather than attempting to keep these persistent predators away through force, the ancient Egyptians did something far more clever. They made one of them a god. If you can't beat them, the thinking went, recruit them. Transform the threat into a protector. Make the jackal who feeds on the dead into the jackal who guards the dead. Fight fire with fire. Fight jackal with jackal. And so Anubis was born. Or more accurately, Inpu. That was his name in the ancient Egyptian language, sometimes rendered as Anpu or Npw, depending on the period and the dialect. The Greeks, who would much later come to know him, would transform this into Anubis, the name by which most of the world recognizes him today. But in those early days, he was simply Inpu, the jackal god who watched over the western desert where the dead were laid to rest. The oldest evidence we have of Anubis comes from the first dynasty of Egypt, around 3,100 years before the Common Era. His image appears on royal tombs, painted or carved with a distinctive profile that would become iconic. A jackal's head, alert and watchful, atop a human body. Sometimes he appeared as a full jackal, lying on his belly atop a shrine or tomb, his ears pricked forward, eternally vigilant. But here's what's remarkable. For him to already be appearing on royal tombs, for him to already be important enough to invoke for protection, his cult must have been established long before. He must have been worshipped during the pre-dynastic period, in the centuries or even millennia before writing allowed us to record his name. Think about what that means. Anubis is one of the very oldest gods we know of. While other deities would rise and fall, while entire religious systems would transform and evolve over Egypt's 3,000-year history as a unified civilization, Anubis endured. From before the pyramids were built to long after Egypt became a Roman province, people prayed to the jackal god. He witnessed the entire sweep of one of humanity's longest-lasting civilizations. He was there at the beginning, and he was there at the end. But who exactly was he? What did his name mean? What were his powers, his responsibilities, his domains? To answer that, we need to understand not just the god himself, but the culture that created him. Because Anubis wasn't simply a deity you could pick up and transplant into another mythology. He was uniquely, specifically Egyptian, born from the particular geography, the particular concerns, the particular genius of the people who lived along the Nile. Let's start with the name. Inpu or Anpu, in its ancient Egyptian form, has a root that means to decay. Not the most pleasant association, perhaps, but deeply appropriate for a god of the dead. Decay, decomposition, the breaking down of the physical form. This was Anubis's domain. But here's where it gets interesting. In ancient Egyptian thought, decay wasn't simply negative. It wasn't just about death and endings. It was also about transformation, about breaking down the old to make way for the new. The flooding of the Nile, which brought life-giving silt to replenish the fields, also caused organic matter to decay and enrich the soil. Death and life were intimately connected, two parts of an eternal cycle. There's another possible meaning too. The word Inpu is also related to Inpi, which can mean royal child or prince. Some scholars think this might have been his original meaning, that he was seen as a divine prince, an heir to cosmic authority. It's entirely possible that both meanings existed simultaneously, that the Egyptians, who loved wordplay and multiple layers of meaning in their hieroglyphs, intentionally chose a name that could signify both decay and royalty. The Prince of Decay, the royal child who rules over death and transformation. But Anubis had far more names than just Inpu. The ancient Egyptians loved epithets, descriptive titles that revealed different aspects of a deity's power and personality. And Anubis collected them like a king collects crowns. Each title told you something about who he was, what he did, where his power was felt. Kenti Amentiu was one of his most important. It means first of the Westerners, or foremost of the Westerners. The West was the direction of the sunset, the direction where the sun died each evening before being reborn at dawn. So naturally, it was associated with death and the afterlife. The necropolis, the vast cemeteries where the Egyptians buried their dead, were built on the west bank of the Nile. To be the first of the Westerners meant to be the lord and protector of all the dead who had gone west, who had traveled to the sunset lands. In the Old Kingdom, before other gods claimed this title, This made Anubis the supreme ruler of the afterlife itself. He was also called Tepi-Juef, which translates to he who is upon his mountain, or he who is upon his sacred mountain. This referred to his role as guardian of the necropolis. The cemeteries were typically built on elevated ground, on cliffs and hillsides, overlooking the Nile Valley. Picture Anubis in his jackal form, sitting atop these heights, watching over the tombs below. A sentinel, a protector. From his vantage point, he could see any threats approaching, any tomb robbers sneaking through the darkness, any evil spirits attempting to disturb the dead. He was always watching. Nebta-Jeza meant Lord of the Sacred Land. The sacred land was the desert itself, that liminal space between the black soil of life and the endless sands of death. It was neither fully of the living world nor entirely of the dead, but a threshold between them. And Anubis ruled it absolutely. Every tomb, every burial ground, every funeral procession that made its way into the desert fell under his protection and authority. Perhaps most evocatively, he was sometimes called Imi-Ut, which means he who is in the place of embalming. This title revealed one of Anubis's most crucial functions. He wasn't just a guardian of the dead. He was the one who prepared them for the afterlife. The place of embalming, a tent or building called the Ibu, was considered sacred space, where the transformation from mortal remains to eternal vessel took place, and Anubis presided over every step of the process. He was in that space, literally and spiritually, guiding the hands of the embalmers, ensuring the rituals were performed correctly. There were other titles too. Master of Secrets, because he knew what lay beyond death, what waited in the afterlife, mysteries that the living could only guess at. The Dog Who Swallows Millions, a somewhat ominous title that emphasized his role in receiving the endless stream of the dead. Ruler of the 9 Bows, referring to the traditional enemies of Egypt, symbolizing his power over all who might threaten the deceased. Each name was a window into a different aspect of his nature, a different way the Egyptians understood and related to him. In hieroglyphics, his name was typically written with specific symbols. A jackal lying atop a shrine or standard was the determinative, the symbol that told you this word is about Anubis. The phonetic signs spelling out Inpu or Anpu would precede it. Later, during the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom periods, his name might be written with the jackal standing on a high platform or pedestal, emphasizing that upon his mountain aspect. The hieroglyphic writing wasn't just functional, it was visual art, and in the case of Anubis's name, it immediately conjured the image of the jackal god in his protective stance. But here's something that might surprise you. Despite being one of Egypt's most recognizable deities, despite his image appearing in countless tombs and temples, despite his importance spanning millennia, Anubis doesn't star in many myths. Unlike Ra or Osiris or Isis or Set, he wasn't the protagonist of grand cosmic dramas. He wasn't overthrowing other gods, or engaging in elaborate conflicts, or transforming himself into different shapes to seduce mortals. Instead, he was more like a constant presence in the background of the Egyptian worldview. Always there, always working, always fulfilling his essential functions. Why? Perhaps because his job was too important to allow for elaborate storytelling. Death is inevitable, constant, and requires constant attention. Anubis couldn't go off on adventures because he had work to do. Every day, people died. Every day, bodies needed to be preserved. Every day, souls needed to be guided and judged. He was, in a sense, the ultimate civil servant of the divine realm. Not flashy, not dramatic, but absolutely essential. Or maybe the Egyptians simply understood that some mysteries shouldn't be elaborated on too much. Death was a threshold, a transformation, something that happened to everyone, but that no one fully understood. By keeping Anubis somewhat enigmatic, by not weaving him into complex narratives, they preserved that sense of mystery. He remained what he had always been, the jackal at the edge of the firelight, the shadow at the corner of your vision, the guardian you hoped you'd never need, but were deeply grateful existed. Now you might be wondering about Anubis's family. Who were his parents? Did he have siblings, a spouse, children? And here's where things get complicated, because unlike gods in some other mythologies who have consistent family trees, Anubis's parentage changed over time, shifted with the centuries, was rewritten to accommodate new religious developments. He has several different origin stories, and rather than choosing one as true and dismissing the others, it's more accurate to say that all of them were true at different times, in different ways, for different people. In the very earliest traditions, the ones from the Old Kingdom, and perhaps even earlier, Anubis was said to be the son of Ra, the sun god. Ra was the supreme deity in the earliest Egyptian religion, the creator who brought forth all things, who sailed across the sky by day in his solar bark and journeyed through the underworld by night. As the son of Ra, Anubis would have had tremendous prestige and authority. He was, in essence, divine royalty, which might explain that royal child aspect of his name. His mother, in these early myths, was usually identified as Hesat, a cow goddess associated with fertility, milk, and nourishment. Sometimes Bastet, the fierce cat-headed goddess, was named as his mother instead. Both of these were goddesses with protective aspects, which makes sense. A protector of the dead would logically be born from protective deities. The combination of Ra's cosmic power and a maternal protective instinct created a god who could shepherd souls through the dangers of death and the afterlife. But then something significant happened in Egyptian religion. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, during what we call the Middle Kingdom, a god named Osiris began to rise in prominence. Osiris had his own mythology, a powerful story of death and resurrection that resonated deeply with Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. As Osiris's cult grew more powerful, as he became more central to Egyptian religious life, something had to give. And what gave was Anubis's position as the supreme lord of the dead. Osiris took over that role. He became the king of the underworld, the judge of the dead, the one who ruled over the realm of the departed. But here's the thing, Anubis was too popular, too deeply embedded in Egyptian funerary practices, too essential to simply discard or diminish. You couldn't have death without Anubis. The embalmers needed him. The funeral rites required his presence. The people wouldn't accept his removal. So the priesthood, the religious scholars, the keepers of mythology did something clever. They rewrote Anubis's family history to connect him directly to Osiris. They made Anubis the son of Osiris, tying him into the Osirian mythology and giving him a new role. Not as the king of the dead, but as Osiris's right hand, his most trusted assistant, the one who prepared the dead and guided them to judgment. The story they created was dramatic, soap opera worthy even. According to this myth, Osiris had an affair with Nephthys, who was both his sister-in-law and the wife of his brother Set. Now Nephthys was associated with mourning, with darkness, with the night. She was a funerary goddess in her own right, which made her a logical mother for a god of death. But she was married to Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the desert, and Set was notoriously violent and jealous. According to the myth told by the Greek writer Plutarch, who recorded it centuries later, Nephthys desired Osiris, but Osiris was faithful to his wife Isis, so Nephthys disguised herself, made herself look like Isis, and in the darkness, Osiris believed he was lying with his own wife. From this deception, Anubis was conceived. When Nephthys realized she was pregnant, she panicked. If Set discovered her infidelity, his rage would be terrible. So when Anubis was born, she abandoned him in the wilderness, leaving him to die. But Isis, Osiris's wife, discovered the infant. And rather than being angry about her husband's infidelity, rather than rejecting this child born of deception, she took compassion on the helpless baby. She adopted Anubis, raised him as her own son, and he grew up as a brother to Horus, Isis's legitimate child with Osiris. This myth did several things simultaneously. It explained Anubis's connection to death and darkness through his mother Nephthys. It tied him directly into the Osiris family, making him part of the most important mythological cycle in Egypt. It gave him a relationship with Isis, the great mother goddess and powerful magician, and it set up his later role in embalming Osiris after Set's murder, which we'll get to shortly. But here's the fascinating part. Even after this new myth became dominant, some regions, some temples, some priests continued to reference the older version, where Anubis was Ra's son. Egyptian religion wasn't monolithic. Different cult centers had different traditions. Different periods emphasized different aspects. A priest in Heliopolis, the city of the sun, might still invoke Anubis as the son of Ra, while a priest in Abydos, the cult center of Osiris, would naturally emphasize his connection to Osiris and Nephthys. There are even some variations where Anubis is the son of Set rather than Osiris. This makes a certain kind of sense. Set was associated with the desert, that wild, dangerous space beyond cultivation. Anubis, as lord of the sacred land, the desert necropolis, would naturally have a connection to that realm. In some myths, Anubis serves as a counterbalance to Set, using similar desert powers but for protection rather than chaos. As for Anubis's own family, that's less elaborated in the myths. He had a consort named Anput, a female version of himself, a goddess depicted with a jackal's head just like his. She was associated with the same funerary roles, the same protection of the dead. And they had a daughter, Kebeshet, sometimes called Kebet or Kebezenuef, depending on the source. Kebeshet was depicted as a serpent or a serpent-headed woman, and her role was beautiful and specific. She offered cool, fresh water to the souls of the dead as they made their way through the trials of the afterlife. After the heat and terror of judgment, after the weighing of the heart, Kebeshet was there with refreshment, with kindness, with relief. She embodied the compassion that balanced her father's stern justice. In some myths, Anubis had other siblings beyond Horus. He was connected to Wepwawet, an earlier jackal god who was sometimes confused with Anubis, sometimes seen as his brother or his original form. Wepwawet, whose name means opener of the ways, was associated with war and funerary practices, and eventually the two jackal gods' roles overlapped so much that they were sometimes treated as interchangeable. The main visual distinction was that Wepwawet was often depicted with grey or white fur, while Anubis was always black. Why black? This is important, enough to linger on. Anubis wasn't black because jackals are black. Real jackals are brown or golden grey. But in Egyptian art and religious symbolism, Anubis was always depicted in deep, glossy black. And this wasn't an arbitrary artistic choice. It was loaded with meaning. Black was the colour of the Nile's fertile silt, the rich soil deposited by the annual flood that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. It was the colour of life, of growth, of abundance. But black was also the colour of decomposition, the colour bodies turned during mummification, when they were treated with natron and coated with resins. It was the colour of transformation, of something passing from one state to another. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, which means the Black Land, referring to that fertile soil. The desert beyond was Deshret, the Red Land, barren and lifeless. So black symbolized life, paradoxically, even as it also symbolized death. Or perhaps it's not so paradoxical, because for the Egyptians, death and life weren't opposites. They were part of a cycle. Things died and decayed and became fertile soil. Seeds sprouted from corpses. The sun died each night and was reborn each dawn. Death was a transformation, not an ending. Anubis, colored black, embodied all of this. He represented decay, yes, but decay that led to regeneration, death that enabled rebirth, the ending that was also a beginning. He was the darkness from which new life emerged, the decomposition that made fertile ground. In a very real sense, Anubis was as much a god of life as he was a god of death, because the two could not be separated. His appearance was striking and instantly recognizable. Usually, he was shown as a man with the head of a jackal, his body strong and upright, often wearing the traditional clothing of an Egyptian nobleman or priest. Sometimes he was completely jackal-formed, lying on his belly with his paws stretched out before him, positioned atop shrines or at the entrance to tombs. His ears were always alert, pointed forward or swiveling, as if constantly listening for disturbances. His snout was long and elegant. His eyes were keen, all-seeing, missing nothing. In his hands, Anubis often held symbolic objects that represented his authority and functions. The was scepter, a long staff with a forked base and a stylized animal head, signified dominion and power over his realm. The Ankh, that famous cross with a loop at the top, represented eternal life, the gift that Anubis offered to those who were properly prepared for the afterlife. Sometimes he held a flail, a symbol of authority borrowed from pharaonic regalia, reminding viewers that he had royal status in the divine hierarchy. When he appeared in tomb art, Anubis was often shown performing specific tasks, leaning over a mummy on an embalming table, his hands working with precision and care, standing at the scales during the weighing of the heart ceremony, adjusting the balance or watching carefully to ensure accuracy, leading a deceased person by the hand, guiding them through the dangers of the Duat, the underworld, toward their final judgment. Positioned at the foot or head of a sarcophagus, eternal guardian, ensuring no harm would come to the sleeper within. His image was everywhere in the Egyptian funerary context, painted on tomb walls in vivid colors, carved in relief on stone sarcophagi, rendered as statues, positioned strategically in burial chambers, molded as amulets worn by the living for protection or placed with the dead to ensure safe passage, created as elaborate shrines like the famous one found in Tutankhamun's tomb, covered in gold leaf and precious materials. No Egyptian burial was complete without at least some invocation of Anubis, some acknowledgement of his power and his essential role in the journey from death to eternity. Think about that for a moment. For over 3,000 years, countless millions of Egyptians went to their graves, with Anubis's image nearby, with his name spoken over them, with prayers addressed to him. He was the last god many Egyptians would appeal to in life, and the first they expected to meet in death. He was the threshold, the doorway, the guardian of that final, terrifying, hoped-for transition. And he never abandoned them. That's what made Anubis remarkable. While other gods rose and fell in prominence, while religious reforms tried to emphasize different deities, while foreign conquerors brought their own gods to Egypt, Anubis remained constant. Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution, which tried to eliminate all gods except the Aten, the sun disk, couldn't erase Anubis from the funerary practices. When the old religion was restored, Anubis was there, unchanged. When the Greeks conquered Egypt, they didn't replace Anubis. They adopted him, connected him to their own psychopomp Hermes, and worshipped the combined figure as Hermanubis. When Rome absorbed Egypt, Anubis's cult spread across the Mediterranean. Why did he endure? Perhaps because death is universal. Civilizations rise and fall, religions transform, empires crumble, but death remains constant. And as long as people die, as long as we must face that final mystery, we need a guardian for that threshold. We need someone to guide us through. We need Anubis. In those early centuries, in that ancient Egypt where he was first conceived and worshipped, Anubis held an even more exalted position than he would later hold. He wasn't just a protector or a guide. He was the Lord of the dead himself, the supreme ruler of the afterlife, the judge who determined every soul's fate. Before Osiris claimed that throne, it belonged to the jackal god. And it's to that earlier Anubis, to the Anubis of the Old Kingdom, to Anubis as supreme death deity, that we need to turn our attention next. In the Old Kingdom, which lasted roughly from 2600 to 2200 years before the Common Era, Egypt was still young, as a unified nation, still establishing the religious and cultural frameworks that would define it for millennia. The pyramids were being built during this period, those massive geometric mountains that still dominate the Giza Plateau today. And in the religious worldview of the time, Anubis held the ultimate power over death and the afterlife. He was Khenti Amentiu, first of the Westerners, the lord of all the dead who had passed into the sunset lands. When an Egyptian died during the Old Kingdom, they didn't expect to face Osiris in judgment. They expected Anubis. He was the one who would evaluate their worthiness, who would determine whether they deserved eternal life or would suffer a second, final death from which there was no return. All the authority, all the terror, all the hope that would later be associated with Osiris's judgment. In the Old Kingdom, that belonged to Anubis. Think about the weight of that responsibility. Every soul that departed from every village, town, and city across Egypt ultimately answered to the jackal god. Pharaohs and peasants, priests and farmers, merchants and soldiers. All of them, in death, became equal before Anubis. The only things that mattered were how they had lived and whether their hearts were pure. The West held special significance for the Egyptians, and understanding this helps us grasp why Anubis was called first of the Westerners. The West was where the sun set each evening, where that great blazing disk of Ra descended below the horizon, appearing to die. But of course, the sun was reborn each dawn, rising in the east in an eternal cycle. So the West represented death, yes, but death with the promise of rebirth, death as part of a larger cosmic pattern. The Nile Valley runs roughly north to south, and the ancient Egyptians built their cities and farms on the eastern bank where the sun rose, where life began each day. The western bank, receiving the setting sun, was reserved for the dead. Necropolis after necropolis sprawled across the western desert, cities of the dead mirroring the cities of the living across the river. To cross the Nile from east to west was to journey from the realm of life into the realm of death. And Anubis ruled that western realm absolutely. He was its king, its protector, its judge. The phrase Westerner became synonymous with the deceased. To go west meant to die, and to be the first of the Westerners meant to be the supreme authority over all who had made that journey, the lord of that vast host of the departed. What did Anubis do with this authority? How did he function as supreme death deity? Our evidence is fragmentary, gleaned from tomb inscriptions, religious texts, and artwork that has survived millennia of weathering and tomb robbery. But we can piece together a picture of his role. First and foremost, Anubis received the dead. When a soul departed its body, when that mysterious moment of transition occurred and the living became the departed, Anubis was there. He would appear to the newly dead, not to frighten them, but to guide them. Ancient Egyptian funerary texts speak of Anubis awakening the dead, of his role in helping souls recognize their new state and begin the journey through the afterlife. This wasn't automatic or easy. The afterlife, which the Egyptians called the Duat, was filled with dangers. Demons lurked there, malevolent spirits who sought to devour souls. There were serpents, crocodiles, and other monsters, magnified versions of the real threats Egyptians faced in life. There were trials to pass, obstacles to overcome, gates that required the correct passwords to open. Without a guide, a soul could easily become lost, could fall prey to these dangers, could fail to reach its final destination. Anubis was that guide. He knew every pathway through the Duat. He knew which gates led where, which demons could be avoided, which challenges had to be faced. He was the psychopomp, a word the Greeks would later use, meaning guide of souls. He took each deceased person by the hand, metaphorically speaking, and led them safely through the perils that lay between death and judgment. But Anubis wasn't just a tour guide through the underworld. He was also its judge. In the Old Kingdom, before the weighing of the heart ceremony became standardized, the exact nature of this judgment varied. Some texts suggest Anubis examined the deceased's heart directly, looking into it to see the truth of their character. Others imply a more complex trial, where the deceased had to prove their worth through knowledge of sacred texts and proper behavior. What we know for certain is that Anubis determined who was worthy of an afterlife and who was not. Those who passed his judgment could proceed to a blessed existence in the field of reeds, a paradisiacal realm that mirrored the best of earthly Egypt. green fields, abundant water, endless harvests, reunions with departed loved ones. It was everything the Egyptian heart desired, eternal life in a perfected version of the world they knew. Those who failed Anubis's judgment faced something worse than death. They faced annihilation. The Egyptians called this the second death, and it was the ultimate terror, not simply dying again, but ceasing to exist entirely. Your name would be forgotten. Your car and bar would be destroyed. It was as if you had never been born, never lived, never existed. Everything that made you yourself would be erased from reality. This was the power Anubis held in the Old Kingdom: life or oblivion, eternity or extinction. Every soul trembled before him, hoping for mercy, praying they had lived well enough to pass through his judgment into the blessed afterlife. But Anubis wasn't cruel or arbitrary. Unlike some death gods in other mythologies who are capricious or malevolent, Anubis was fundamentally just. He enforced Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of truth, justice, order, and cosmic balance. If you had lived according to Ma'at, if your heart was true, if you had done right by your family and your community and the gods, then Anubis would recognize that. He would welcome you. He would guide you to your reward. The emphasis was always on proper conduct in life. You couldn't bribe your way past Anubis. You couldn't trick him or deceive him. He saw through all pretenses, all false righteousness, all claims of virtue that weren't backed by actual virtuous behavior. In this sense, Anubis was the ultimate enforcer of ethical behavior. Be good, not because someone is watching, but because one day you'll face the jackal god, and he'll know the truth of who you were. This brings us to one of Anubis's most crucial roles, the one that would remain central to his identity even after he lost his position as supreme judge: the invention and practice of mummification, the sacred art of preserving the body so the soul could return to it in the afterlife. Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife were complex, built on ideas about the multiple aspects of a person's being. You had your cat, your physical body; your ka, your life force or vital energy; your bear, your personality and soul, often depicted as a human-headed bird; your name, which was an essential part of your identity; your shadow, which was strangely considered separate from the body; and several other components depending on which texts and which period you're examining. The crucial thing was that these different aspects could separate at death. The Ba and K would leave the body, would journey through the afterlife, but they needed to be able to return to the body, to reunite with it. The body was the anchor, the home base, the vessel that allowed these spiritual components to continue existing. If the body was destroyed, if it decayed completely or was consumed by scavengers, then the soul would have nowhere to return. It would be lost, homeless, unable to properly exist in the afterlife. This made preserving the body absolutely essential. And this, according to Egyptian mythology, was Anubis's invention. He was the one who first discovered how to prevent decay, how to transform a corpse into a mummy that could last forever. The story goes that Anubis first practiced this art on Osiris himself after Osiris was murdered by Set. But we'll get to that story in detail soon. For now, what matters is that Anubis was credited as the divine inventor, first practitioner of mummification, and every embalmer in Egypt was following techniques that Anubis had taught them. The actual process of mummification was intricate, time-consuming, and frankly, quite gruesome. It took 70 days to complete, and it required both technical skill and ritual precision. Let's walk through it, because understanding the process helps us understand how deeply Anubis was embedded in Egyptian funerary practice. First, the body of the deceased was brought to the place of embalming, the Ibu, or the beautiful house, as it was sometimes called. This wasn't done in public or in regular buildings. It was sacred space, a tent or dedicated structure where the transformation from corpse to eternal vessel would take place. And Anubis was believed to be present there, not just symbolically, but actually guiding the hands of the embalmers. The chief embalmer, the one overseeing the entire process, would wear a mask representing Anubis. These masks were beautifully crafted, carved from wood and painted black, with the characteristic pointed ears and elongated snout of the jackal god. When the embalmer put on this mask, he wasn't just pretending to be Anubis or honoring Anubis. According to Egyptian belief, he became Anubis, or at least a vessel for Anubis's power and presence. The god worked through him, ensuring the rituals were performed correctly. The first step was removal of the brain. The Egyptians didn't consider the brain particularly important. They thought the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion, the organ that did all the thinking. So the brain was simply discarded. The embalmers would insert a long hooked instrument up through the nostril, break through the thin bone at the back of the nasal cavity, and literally scramble the brain, breaking it into pieces that could be pulled out through the nose. Not a pleasant image, but efficiency mattered. Next came the internal organs. The embalmers would make an incision along the left side of the abdomen, a cut about 4 inches long. Through this opening, they would carefully remove the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines. These organs had their own important role to play in the afterlife, so they couldn't simply be discarded. Instead, they were treated separately, mummified individually, and placed in special containers called canopic jars. Each canopic jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus, lesser deities who served as guardians of the viscera. Imseti, who had a human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, with a baboon head, protected the lungs. Duamutef, with a jackal head like Anubis himself, watched over the stomach. And Kebesenuef, with a falcon head, guarded the intestines. These jars would be placed in the tomb alongside the mummy, keeping the organs safe until they could be reunited with the body in the afterlife. But one organ was never removed. The heart stayed in the body. This was absolutely crucial. The heart would need to be present for judgment, for the weighing that would determine the deceased's fate. Without the heart, there could be no afterlife, so the embalmers left it in place, carefully preserved within the chest cavity. Once the organs were removed, the body cavity was washed with palm wine and spices, both to clean it and to help preserve it with aromatic substances. Then came the natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that the Egyptians found in deposits around dry lake beds. Natron was the key to the entire process. The body would be packed with natron, covered in it, buried in it. This powerful desiccant would draw out all the moisture from the tissues, leaving them dried and preserved. The body would remain in the natron for about 40 days, giving it time to thoroughly dehydrate. By the end of this period, the corpse would have lost a tremendous amount of weight and volume, shrunken and leathery, but preserved against decay. After the natron stage, the body was washed again, this time with water from the Nile. The sacred river, the source of all life in Egypt, had a role even in death. Then the embalmers would treat the skin with oils and resins, substances that would further preserve the body and give it a more lifelike appearance. Fragrant unguents were applied, expensive aromatics like myrrh and frankincense that would make the mummy smell pleasant and sacred rather than of decay. The empty body cavity was stuffed with materials to help it maintain its shape. Linen, sawdust, even mud or sand, anything to fill the space where the organs had been. Sometimes fragrant herbs were included, more for ritual purposes than practical ones. In the finest mummifications during the New Kingdom, when the art reached its peak, embalmers would even try to restore the body's features, inserting packing under the skin to make the face look more natural. Then came the wrapping. This wasn't simply covering the body with bandages. It was a ritual act, performed in stages over many days, with prayers and spells recited at each step. The embalmers would start with the fingers and toes, wrapping each individually, then the limbs, then the torso. Between the layers of linen, they would place amulets, small magical objects meant to protect the deceased in the afterlife. There were amulets in the shape of the Eye of Horus for healing and wholeness, amulets representing the Djed pillar, symbol of Osiris's backbone and of stability, heart scarabs carved with spells from the Book of the Dead, meant to prevent the heart from testifying against its owner during judgment, and amulets of Anubis himself, ensuring his protection continued even after the mummification was complete. The entire body would end up wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, layer upon layer, until the human form was completely encased. Over the face, they might place a mask, painted or gilded, to represent the deceased as they wish to appear in eternity. For pharaohs and the very wealthy, these masks could be works of art, beaten gold inlaid with semi-precious stones. For ordinary people, a simpler mask of painted cartonnage, a kind of papier-mâché made from linen and plaster. Throughout all of this, prayers were spoken. The embalmers would recite spells from the pyramid texts or the coffin texts, or later, the Book of the Dead. These were instructions for the deceased, guidance for the journey ahead, protective incantations against the dangers of the afterlife. And many of these spells were addressed to or invoked Anubis, asking for his blessing, his protection, his guidance. When the mummification was finally complete after those 70 days, the body was placed in a coffin, often elaborately decorated with religious imagery and inscribed with more protective spells. Wealthy individuals might have multiple nested coffins, each one fitting inside the next, layer upon layer of protection. The outermost might be a stone sarcophagus weighing tons, carved with intricate reliefs. And then came the funeral, the journey from the land of the living to the land of the dead. This was a procession, sometimes simple, sometimes elaborate, depending on the deceased's status. The coffin would be placed on a sledge and dragged by oxen or by men toward the necropolis. Family members would follow, along with hired mourners, professional women who would wail and tear their clothes and beat their breasts, publicly performing the grief that validated the deceased's importance. Priests walked in the procession, chanting prayers, burning incense that would purify the air and please the gods. They carried offerings, the possessions that would be buried with the deceased, furniture, clothing, food, drink, games, tools, everything the person might need in the afterlife. For pharaohs and nobles, this could include entire boats, chariots, life-size statues, even mummified pets. At the tomb, the most crucial ritual of all took place, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was the moment when the mummy, which was essentially an elaborate corpse, became a vessel capable of housing the returned Bi'er and Keh. It was reanimated, in a sense, given back its senses and capabilities for use in the afterlife. A priest wearing the Anubis mask would hold the coffin upright, positioning it so it faced south, toward Osiris's realm in the starry sky. Another priest, often called the Sem priest, and typically the deceased's eldest son, would use special ceremonial tools to symbolically touch the mummy's mouth, eyes, ears, and nose. Each touch was accompanied by spells that would restore that sense or function. Touch the mouth, and the deceased could speak again, could recite the necessary prayers and passwords of the afterlife. Touch the eyes, and they could see the wonders of the world beyond death. Touch the ears, and they could hear the voices of the gods. Touch the nose, and they could breathe, could smell the incense offered to them, could exist as a living being in the realm of the dead. This ceremony explicitly identified the priest performing it with Anubis. The spells make this clear. Anubis opens your eyes. Anubis opens your ears. Anubis opens your mouth. The god himself was present, performing this final crucial service for the deceased, ensuring they were properly equipped for the journey ahead. Only after the opening of the mouth was complete would the mummy be sealed in its tomb, surrounded by its grave goods. The door closed and sealed with clay, stamped with protective symbols. Often these seals included images of Anubis, the jackal god sitting atop the 9 bows representing Egypt's enemies, symbolizing his protective power. If anyone tried to break into the tomb, if any thief or vandal attempted to disturb the deceased, they would have to break Anubis's seal. And that was, both legally and spiritually, a terrible risk to take. Because Anubis didn't just protect the dead in the afterlife, he protected them in death as well, in their physical tombs. This was another of his crucial roles, and it persisted long after he lost his position as supreme judge. As lord of the sacred land, as he who is upon his mountain, Anubis was the guardian of the necropolis, the defender of tombs, the nemesis of grave robbers. The threat of tomb robbery was constant throughout Egyptian history. Those elaborate burials, with their gold and jewels and precious goods, were tempting targets. The Egyptians tried to prevent theft through practical means, certainly. Hiding tombs, cutting them deep into cliffsides, sealing entrances with massive stone blocks, creating false chambers and dead ends to confuse robbers. But they also relied on divine protection, on curses and warnings that would frighten away potential thieves. And Anubis was at the center of these protections. Tomb inscriptions would invoke his name, warning that anyone who disturbed the dead would face his wrath. Sometimes these warnings were specific and creative. He who enters this tomb with evil intent, Anubis will twist his neck like a goose, was one recorded curse. The crocodile, the hippopotamus, and the lion will devour he who disturbs this place, and Anubis will judge him harshly in the afterlife, was another. These weren't idle threats. The Egyptians believed that Anubis actively patrolled the necropolis, that his jackal form prowled the cliffs and valleys where the tombs were cut. He could see in the darkness, could detect intruders, could summon his power against them. Tomb robbers risked not just execution if they were caught by human authorities, but divine punishment from the jackal god himself. Even in his visual representations guarding tombs, Anubis exuded menace. He was often shown as a reclining jackal. Yes, but not sleeping or resting. His head was always up, alert, his ears forward, his eyes open, watching, waiting, ready to spring into action if needed. In some images, he's shown standing over 9 bound prisoners, each representing one of Egypt's traditional enemies, his paw placed dominantly on their backs. The message was clear. Anyone who threatened the dead, anyone who violated the sacred space of the tomb, would be treated as an enemy of Egypt itself, subject to the full weight of divine justice. There's a fascinating psychological aspect to this. By making the jackal a protector, the Egyptians transformed their fear into security. Those wild dogs that had originally threatened burials were now symbolically working for them rather than against them. Every time a real jackal appeared near the necropolis, it could be interpreted as Anubis himself patrolling his domain. The thing that had been a source of anxiety became a source of comfort. This kind of psychological transformation, turning a threat into a protector, turning fear into reverence, is one of the deepest functions of religion. And Anubis exemplifies it perfectly. He was born from the Egyptians' fear of death and desecration, but he became their greatest comfort in facing those fears. With Anubis watching over them, they could rest easier, both literally in their tombs and metaphorically in their approach to mortality. For over 1,000 years, through the Old Kingdom and into the Middle Kingdom, Anubis held this exalted position. He was the supreme death god, the inventor of mummification, the guardian of tombs, the judge of souls. His importance couldn't be overstated. Without Anubis, there was no proper afterlife. Without his blessing and guidance, the dead were lost. But then something changed. A new god rose to prominence, bringing with him a new mythology so powerful it would transform Egyptian religion forever. That god was Osiris, and his ascension meant Anubis would have to accept a new role, a diminished position, though one that remained absolutely crucial. It's time to talk about that transformation, about how Anubis went from king to servant, and how the greatest story in Egyptian mythology gave the jackal god a new purpose. Around the year 2000 before the Common Era, during Egypt's Middle Kingdom period, something remarkable happened in Egyptian religious thought. A god who had existed in the pantheon for centuries began to gain unprecedented prominence, his mythology resonating so deeply with the Egyptian people that it would come to dominate their conception of death and the afterlife. That god was Osiris. Osiris's story is one of the most powerful myths in all of Egyptian religion. It's a tale of murder and resurrection, of love conquering death, of justice ultimately prevailing over chaos. And it would change everything for Anubis, forcing the jackal god to relinquish his throne as supreme lord of the dead and accept a new, more subordinate role. But before we talk about what Anubis lost, we need to understand what Osiris offered that made this transformation acceptable, even necessary. Why did the Egyptian people embrace Osiris so completely that they were willing to displace Anubis from his position of ultimate authority? Osiris represented something that earlier death gods, including Anubis, didn't quite embody: hope, explicit, powerful hope in resurrection and renewal. Osiris was a god who had been murdered, who had experienced death himself, who had descended into the underworld and then returned to life. Not to earthly life, not to his mortal body, but to a transformed existence as Lord of the Dead. He had conquered death not by avoiding it, but by passing through it and emerging transformed on the other side. This resonated profoundly with Egyptian beliefs about the cycles of nature. The Nile flooded annually, bringing both destruction and new life. Seeds had to be buried in the dark earth before they could sprout. The sun died each night and was reborn each morning. Death and rebirth were everywhere in the Egyptian worldview, and Osiris embodied this principle perfectly. He was the grain that had to die and be buried before it could bring the harvest. He was the promise that death was not an ending, but a transformation into something better. Compare this to Anubis's role as it had been understood in the Old Kingdom. Anubis was certainly not malevolent. He guided and protected, but he was primarily a judge, someone who evaluated whether you were worthy of the afterlife. The emphasis was on judgment, on worthiness, on passing a test. Osiris shifted the emphasis to transformation, to the idea that death itself could be defeated through proper rituals and divine assistance. The Osiris myth, as it came to be told and retold across Egypt, went something like this. Osiris was originally a god-king who ruled Egypt in a golden age, teaching humans agriculture, law, civilization. He was beloved by his people and by his wife Isis, who was his sister and partner in bringing order and prosperity to the world. Osiris represented everything good about kingship, about civilization, about the organized cultivation that separated Egypt from the chaos of the desert. But Osiris had a brother, Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the desert. Set was jealous of Osiris's power and popularity. The reasons for this jealousy varied depending on which version of the myth you heard, but the result was always the same. Set planned his brother's murder, and he executed that plan with cunning and brutality. In the most famous version of the story, Set commissioned a beautiful chest, elaborately decorated, perfectly sized. He threw a banquet and announced that this magnificent chest would be given to whoever fit inside it perfectly. Of course, the chest had been built to Osiris's exact measurements. When Osiris climbed inside to try it, Set's co-conspirators immediately slammed the lid shut, nailed it closed, and sealed it with molten lead. Then they threw the sealed chest into the Nile, with Osiris trapped inside, drowning and suffocating. The chest floated downriver and eventually out to sea, washing up on the coast of Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon. There, according to the myth, a tree grew around it, incorporating the chest into its trunk. The tree was cut down and used as a pillar in the palace of a local king, with Osiris's body still hidden inside. Meanwhile, Isis was devastated by her husband's disappearance. She traveled throughout Egypt, searching for any trace of him, questioning everyone, following any lead, refusing to give up hope. Her search eventually led her to Phoenicia, where through a series of events involving her serving as a nursemaid in the palace, she discovered the pillar containing Osiris's body. She brought it back to Egypt and hid it in the marshes of the Nile Delta while she attempted to resurrect him through her powerful magic. But Set discovered where Isis had hidden the body. In a rage, he tore Osiris's corpse apart, dismembering it into 14 pieces, some versions say 16, others 42, and scattered them across the length and breadth of Egypt. Each piece was hidden in a different location, making resurrection seem impossible. How could Isis restore her husband if his very body was torn asunder and spread from the Delta to Nubia? Yet Isis refused to accept defeat. She enlisted the help of her sister Nephthys, Set's own wife, who had grown disgusted with her husband's cruelty. Together, the two goddesses began a second search, this time looking for every scattered piece of Osiris's body. They traveled the length of the Nile, from the marshes of Lower Egypt to the cataracts of the south, and according to the myth, they found all the pieces except one, his phallus, which had been eaten by a fish. This is where Anubis enters the Osiris myth, and this is where his role begins its transformation. In this version of the story, Anubis was already born, the son of Osiris and Nephthys from their illicit affair, but raised by Isis as her own. When Isis and Nephthys gathered all the pieces of Osiris's body, they didn't know how to restore him. The body was in pieces. How could life return to something so thoroughly destroyed? Anubis had the answer. He took the pieces, and using his divine knowledge and skill, he reassembled them. He was the first to perform the sacred art of embalming on a god, using techniques that would become the template for all future mummifications. He carefully fitted the pieces back together. He wrapped the body in linen strips woven by Isis and Nephthys. He anointed it with oils and unguents. He spoke the proper incantations to preserve and sanctify it. For the missing phallus, Isis used her magic to create a replacement from gold, and this allowed her to conceive one final time with her restored husband. From this posthumous union would come Horus, Osiris's heir and avenger, who would grow up to challenge Set for the throne of Egypt. But Osiris himself could not return to earthly life. He had been too fundamentally transformed by death. Instead, through the combined efforts of Anubis's embalming, Isis's magic, and the proper funerary rituals, Osiris was resurrected into a new form of existence. He descended into the Duat, the underworld, and there he became its king, the Lord of the dead, the one who would judge souls and welcome the righteous into his eternal realm. And Anubis, who had been that Lord, who had been that judge, willingly stepped aside to serve Osiris in this new role. This is a fascinating moment in the evolution of Egyptian mythology, and it tells us something important about how their religion functioned. Gods didn't simply disappear when they were supplanted by newer, more popular deities. Instead, they were incorporated, their stories adjusted, their roles modified to fit into the new framework. Anubis was too important, too deeply embedded in Egyptian funerary practice to simply remove. So instead, the priesthood made him Osiris's son, his assistant, his right hand. Rather than being competition, Anubis and Osiris became partners in the complex machinery of death and resurrection. Osiris ruled the underworld and sat in judgment, but Anubis remained essential to every stage of the process. He still invented and oversaw mummification. He still protected tombs and guided souls. He still maintained order in the realm of the dead. He just did it now under Osiris's ultimate authority rather than his own. In a way, this actually enriched Anubis's character and expanded his role in mythology. As an independent supreme deity, Anubis had been somewhat static, unchanging, performing his functions without much narrative development. But as Osiris's son and servant, he gained relationships, gained a place in stories, gained emotional depth and complexity. The myth of how Anubis came to serve Osiris added layers to his identity. He was the illegitimate son, the child of deception, abandoned by his birth mother out of fear. But he was also the adopted son, raised with love by Isis, given a place in the divine family. He was the one who saved his father through his skill at embalming, who made resurrection possible, who literally put Osiris back together. There's a beautiful symbolism there. The god of death became the instrument of resurrection, and Anubis accepted this new role with what seemed to be grace and dedication. There are no myths of Anubis resenting his demotion or rebelling against Osiris's authority. Instead, he served faithfully, using his powers to protect his father and assist in the proper function of the afterlife. He became Osiris's most loyal servant, the one Osiris trusted absolutely to carry out essential functions. This relationship between Osiris and Anubis became central to Egyptian funerary beliefs moving forward. When someone died and was mummified, Anubis was performing the same service for them that he had performed for Osiris. When a soul was guided through the Duat, Anubis was leading them, just as he had led Osiris. When judgment came, Anubis would present the deceased to Osiris, just as a faithful servant presents visitors to his lord. The Osiris myth also added another famous story involving Anubis, one that explained a natural phenomenon while reinforcing his protective role. According to this tale, after Osiris had been reassembled and mummified, Set wasn't finished with his hatred. He wanted to destroy the body again, to prevent Osiris's resurrection and maintain his own power. Set disguised himself as a leopard, beautiful and sleek, to approach Osiris's body undetected. But Anubis, ever vigilant, saw through the disguise. He seized Set and threw him down, then took a hot brand, a rod of iron heated in fire, and pressed it against Set's spotted hide. The leopard howled and writhed, but Anubis held him firm, burning him over and over, marking him with the brand. This, the myth claimed, is why leopards have spots. Each spot is a burn mark from Anubis's brand, a permanent reminder of Set's defeat and Anubis's protection. It's a vivid image, the jackal god standing over the spotted cat, marking him as punishment for attempting to violate the dead. And it sent a clear message. Anyone who tries to harm those under Anubis's protection, even another god, will be caught and punished. But Anubis didn't stop there. According to some versions of the tale, after branding Set, Anubis flayed him, removed his entire spotted hide from his body. Then Anubis wore that skin as a cloak, a gruesome trophy and warning. Dressed in Set's own skin, Anubis infiltrated Set's army and, in one mighty slash of his blade, decapitated every single one of Set's followers. The land where this slaughter occurred was said to be stained red ever after, the mineral composition of the earth making it look blood-soaked even centuries later. This is a different side of Anubis than we usually see. Not the calm, measured guardian and guide, but a fierce warrior protector, willing to visit terrible violence on those who threaten the dead. It's a reminder that protection sometimes requires force, that guardianship isn't always gentle. Anubis would guide souls with compassion, yes, but he would also destroy anyone who tried to prevent souls from reaching their proper rest. These myths, as they spread across Egypt, didn't diminish Anubis. If anything, they made him more complex, more interesting, more vital to the religious framework. His role shifted, certainly. He was no longer the supreme authority, but he remained irreplaceable. Without Anubis, Osiris couldn't have been resurrected. Without Anubis, no human could properly be mummified. Without Anubis, souls couldn't safely reach judgment. The Middle Kingdom and beyond, Anubis wasn't lesser than he had been. He was different, his power operating through different channels, but still absolutely essential. This brings us to what would become Anubis's most famous role, the one that appears in countless tomb paintings and papyri, the image that has become iconic of ancient Egyptian funerary religion. His role in the weighing of the heart ceremony, where he served as the guardian of the scales and determined each soul's ultimate fate. In the Hall of Two Truths, in the presence of Osiris and the 42 divine judges, each deceased person would face their ultimate test. Everything came down to this moment. All the preparations, all the rituals, all the prayers and spells, all of it led to this one ceremony where worthiness would be determined objectively, mathematically, with divine precision. The heart, which the embalmers had carefully left in the body during mummification, would be removed and placed on one side of a balanced scale. On the other side would be placed a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, and Anubis would operate the scales, adjusting them, ensuring accuracy, watching carefully to see which way the balance tipped. This scene appears so frequently in ancient Egyptian art that it's become the defining image of their beliefs about judgment. The deceased stands to one side, sometimes accompanied by their biar bird, sometimes holding hands with a guide. Osiris sits on his throne, mummiform, holding his crook and flail, the symbols of kingship. The 42 judges watch from their thrones or perches. Amit, the devourer, crouches nearby, her crocodile head and lion forelegs and hippopotamus hindquarters making her appear as a nightmare collection of Egypt's most dangerous animals. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, stands ready with his scribal palette to record the results. And at the center of everything is Anubis, jackal-headed, his hands on the scales, making sure the weighing is done correctly. If the heart balanced with the feather, if it was light, unburdened by sin and evil deeds, the deceased passed. They were declared true of voice, justified, worthy. Osiris would welcome them into his realm. They could proceed to the field of reeds, the blessed afterlife, where they would live forever in peace and plenty. It was what every Egyptian hoped for, prayed for, tried to earn through a lifetime of proper behavior. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by wrongdoing, lies, cruelty, violations of Ma'at, then doom was certain. Amit would lurch forward and devour the heart. Without the heart, the deceased's Ba and Ka could not exist. They would suffer the second death, complete annihilation, erasure from existence. No afterlife, no peace, no memory, as if they had never been. The Egyptians feared this fate more than anything. To die was one thing, a natural part of the cycle of existence. But to be destroyed, to cease to be forgotten, this was the ultimate horror. And Anubis, operating the scales, determined which fate awaited each soul. This is why Anubis's role as guardian of the scales was so crucial. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't symbolic. He was literally deciding matters of eternal life or death. But unlike a capricious judge who might play favorites or be swayed by bribes, Anubis was portrayed as absolutely fair, absolutely honest, absolutely incorruptible. The scales didn't lie, and Anubis made sure the scales were accurate. There's an important principle here about ancient Egyptian ethics. The weighing of the heart was automatic, mechanical even. Your deeds determined the weight of your heart. If you had lived well, treating others fairly, honoring the gods, maintaining May-at in your community, your heart would be light. If you had lied, stolen, murdered, broken oaths, caused suffering, your heart would be heavy. Anubis didn't decide which. He simply revealed the truth that was already present. He was less a judge pronouncing sentence and more a technician operating equipment that made moral reality visible. This gave Anubis a unique character among death gods across various mythologies. He wasn't feared as cruel or arbitrary. He was respected as just, as someone who could be trusted to evaluate souls fairly. If you were afraid of Anubis's judgment, it was because you knew you deserved that fear, not because you thought he might be unfair. The Book of the Dead, that collection of spells and instructions meant to guide the deceased through the afterlife, contains numerous references to Anubis and the weighing ceremony. One spell in particular, Spell 30B, was specifically designed to help at this moment. It was addressed to the heart itself, basically begging it not to testify against its owner during the weighing. "O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my being, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not rebel against me before the guardian of the scales." The spell continues with assurances that the deceased has lived properly, has committed no sins, has nothing to hide. It's a desperate plea for the heart to be light, for the weighing to go well, for Anubis to find the deceased worthy. Many Egyptians had this spell, or portions of it, inscribed on heart scarabs, amulets shaped like scarab beetles that would be placed over the heart during mummification. The idea was that the scarab, with its carved spell, would magically ensure the heart behaved properly during judgment. It was a kind of insurance policy, a way to hedge your bets and make absolutely certain you'd pass Anubis's test. This tells us something about how seriously the Egyptians took this ceremony. They prepared for it their entire lives. They tried to live according to Ma'at so their hearts would naturally be light. They commissioned elaborate tombs and expensive mummifications to improve their chances. They had prayers and spells and amulets created to help them through each stage. The weighing of the heart was the culmination of everything, and Anubis was the one who made it happen. So yes, Anubis had lost his position as Supreme Lord of the Dead. That title now belonged to Osiris. But in exchange, Anubis gained something else. He became the essential functionary of the afterlife, the one whose presence and participation was required at every crucial stage. Without Anubis embalming the body, there was no proper preservation. Without Anubis guiding the soul, there was no safe passage through the Duat. Without Anubis operating the scales, there was no judgment. Osiris might rule, but Anubis made that rule possible and effective. In a sense, Anubis became even more universal in the Middle Kingdom and after. During the Old Kingdom, he was supreme, but perhaps somewhat distant, a lord to be feared more than loved. After the transformation, After he became part of the Osirian mythology, he was more accessible, more personal, more intimately connected to each individual's death and afterlife. He was the god you could count on to be there for you, the one who would make sure everything was done right, the one who wanted you to succeed in reaching the blessed afterlife. This is why Anubis's worship didn't decline even after Osiris rose to prominence. In fact, his cult grew stronger, more widespread, more popular, because now he wasn't just a distant king of the dead. He was your guide, your protector, your advocate. He was the one who would stand beside you in the Hall of Two Truths and ensure the weighing was fair. He was on your side, not in opposition to you, as long as your heart was true. Temples and shrines to Anubis existed throughout Egypt, from the Delta to Nubia. His main cult center remained at Sinopolis in Upper Egypt, the city of the dog, where priests maintained his worship and vast numbers of mummified dogs and jackals were buried as offerings. But you could find Anubis venerated in every major necropolis, at every funerary temple, in every embalmer's workshop. He was everywhere death occurred, which meant he was everywhere. And as we'll see next, the way Egyptians worshipped Anubis, the rituals they performed in his name, the physical spaces dedicated to him, these all reflect his enduring importance despite the transformation of his role. The god might have stepped down from the throne, but he never left the sacred spaces where death and eternity met. If you enjoyed learning about Anubis and want to see more deep dives into ancient mythology, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what other Egyptian gods you'd like to hear about, or if there's another mythology you're interested in exploring. Good night to you all.